Hi and welcome. I'm Midnight Truth, and it's so nice to have you here tonight, wherever you are right now. Whether you're in bed, lying on the couch, or just looking for a quiet moment, I want you to know this time is for you. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, feel the weight of the day start to fade. Let your mind settle, let your body relax, and let yourself simply be. There's no rush, no pressure, just this calm, quiet moment. If you'd like, you can close your eyes and imagine yourself in a peaceful place. Maybe it's a cozy room with soft, warm lighting. Or maybe it's under a starry sky, with a gentle breeze brushing against you. Wherever you feel safe and calm, let yourself drift there. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Tonight's story is gentle and soothing, perfect to carry you into a deep, restful sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. The day I moved into the old house on Birchwood Lane, the sky hung low and gray, as if the heavens themselves were reluctant to let in light. I parked my car on the cracked driveway and stared at the building before me. The realtor had called it quaint and charming, but up close, it looked more tired. The white paint on the wooden siding was peeling, and the shutters, once a deep forest green, were now faded to a muted, sickly hue. Still, it was mine. After the divorce, I needed a fresh start, somewhere cheap and quiet. This house checked both boxes. It was miles away from the bustling city where my life had fallen apart, a perfect place to collect myself and begin anew. I told myself the house wasn't old. It was vintage. Character, I thought. That's what it had. As I stepped onto the creaky porch with my first box of belongings, the door opened a fraction, making me freeze. A strong gust of wind howled through the trees, and the door swayed slightly before coming to rest. "It's just the wind," I muttered under my breath, even as the hair on my arms prickled. The inside was just as I remembered from the tour. Dark with paneling, scuffed hardwood floors, and the faint smell of something earthy and damp. The air was cool, despite the warmth of late summer outside. The house had quirks. A few sticky windows, floorboards that groaned under the weight of a feather, and an odd draft that seemed to come from nowhere. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I spent the rest of the day unpacking the essentials. My clothes, a few kitchen items, and my favorite books. I decided to leave the heavier lifting for the next day. By the time I finally collapsed onto the worn leather couch, night had fallen, and the house was cloaked in shadows. That's when I heard the first sound, a soft creak. It came from upstairs, like the weight of someone shifting their position. My first instinct was to freeze, listening intently. It's an old house, I reminded myself. Old houses make noises, but as I sat there, straining to hear, another creak followed, then a faint thump, as though something, or someone, was moving slowly across the floor above me. I stood up and flicked on the nearest light. The warm glow of the lamp didn't do much to settle my nerves. Clutching my phone in one hand, I tiptoed to the base of the staircase. "Hello." My voice sounded weak. Even to me, silence. I waited a full minute, my heart thudding in my chest, before laughing nervously. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself. Still, I double-checked that the doors were locked before heading to bed. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains in my bedroom, chasing away the unease of the night before. I felt silly for letting my imagination run wild, but it was my first night in a new place. Adjustments were normal. I chalked the noises up to the house settling, old with shifting as the temperature dropped. After making a quick breakfast of toast and coffee, I decided to explore the house more thoroughly. I hadn't had much time to look around during the move, and now, in the daylight, I wanted to familiarize myself with every creak and corner. The upstairs consisted of 3 bedrooms and a small bathroom. The largest bedroom was mine, and the 2 smaller ones were mostly empty, except for a few forgotten pieces of furniture left behind by previous owners. A rocking chair with peeling white paint, a small desk missing a drawer, and a cracked mirror leaning against the wall in the farthest room. That room made me pause. It was darker than the others, even with the curtains pulled back. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow. There was an odd smell too, not overwhelming, but faint and sour, like something had been left to spoil. I wrinkled my nose and made a mental note to clean it later. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. The rocking chair in the corner. Had it always been angled toward the window? I couldn't remember. Shaking my head, I blamed my overactive imagination again and moved on. Downstairs, I busied myself unpacking the rest of my things. I put books on the shelves, arranged my dishes in the kitchen cabinets, and hung a few framed photos on the walls to make the space feel more like home. By mid-afternoon, I was covered in dust, but satisfied with the progress. It wasn't until I went outside to take a break that I met my first neighbor. Afternoon, the man's voice startled me as I stood in the front yard, stretching my sore arms. I turned to see an older man walking his dog, a scruffy golden retriever with a gray muzzle. The man tipped his hat in greeting. "Moving in, are you?" "Yeah," I said, smiling. "Just yesterday." "Welcome to Birchwood Lane," he said, leaning on the fence that separated my yard from the sidewalk. "Name's Howard. Lived here for 30 years. Give or take." "Nice to meet you, Howard. I'm Claire." He nodded, his weathered face crinkling into a smile. "That's a fine house you've got there. Bit of a history to it, though." I raised an eyebrow. "History?" Howard hesitated, glancing at the house as though he didn't want it to overhear. "Well, I don't mean to spook you, but folks around here talk. Last couple of people who lived there didn't stick around too long. Said they heard things, saw things. One woman came running out in the middle of the night, screaming her head off. Poor thing wouldn't even come back to get her stuff." I laughed nervously. "Old houses are like that, right? They make weird noises, and people let their imaginations run wild." "Sure," Howard said, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. He gave a small shrug and a parting wave. "Well, if you need anything, I'm just a few houses down." "Good luck, Claire." As I watched him walk away, the dog wagging its tail at his side, I couldn't shake the feeling that Howard had wanted to say more but held back. That night, the house felt different. Maybe it was Howard's words lingering in my mind, or maybe it was something else, but the shadows seemed longer, darker. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I settled into bed, determined to ignore my nerves, but sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, my ears straining for any sound. For hours, there was nothing but the occasional groan of the house settling. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. They moved down the hallway outside my bedroom, pausing just outside my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I held my breath, too scared to move. A long, agonizing minute passed. Then the footsteps moved away, heading back down the hall toward the stairs. I sat up, trembling. My logical brain insisted it was just the house again, but deep down, I didn't believe it. I didn't sleep at all that night. The morning sunlight did little to erase the terror of the previous night. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, my hands trembling as I gripped the mug. My mind raced with explanations. A draft, a raccoon in the walls, maybe even a prank by some neighborhood kid. Anything but the alternative. Still, I couldn't ignore how real it had felt. The slow, measured pace of the footsteps, the way they paused right outside my door, wasn't random. It was deliberate. By the time noon rolled around, I decided I had two choices. Let my imagination spiral out of control or face the house head-on. I opted for the latter. Armed with cleaning supplies and a flashlight, I started with the basement. The basement was accessed through a narrow door in the kitchen, hidden behind a set of folding shutters. The stairs leading down were steep and uneven, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. I flipped the light switch, and a single bulb flickered weakly to life. casting jagged shadows across the stone walls. The space was mostly empty, save for a few broken pieces of furniture and a stack of old boxes pushed into the corner. Dust motes danced in the stale air as I moved deeper into the room, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. I hesitated before opening the first box. Inside were random odds and ends. Yellowed papers, a broken lamp, a tattered scarf. The second box was much the same, but the third box held something different, a small leather-bound book. The cover was plain, save for a faint engraving I could barely make out. A series of strange symbols arranged in a circle. I flipped it open, revealing pages filled with cramped handwriting. The ink was faded, but the words were legible. August 3rd, 1912. Asterisk, I had begun my work in earnest. The others warned me not to meddle, but they do not understand the power I have unlocked. The veil is thinner here. This house, this place, it is special. I feel it in my bones, asterisk. A chill ran down my spine as I read. The entries were dated over the course of several years, written by someone named Elias Hawthorne. From the fragmented descriptions, it seemed Elias had been obsessed with the occult, conducting rituals and experiments in the house. October 14th, 1913. Asterisk, last night, I heard them again, whispers in the dark, coming from the walls. They grow louder with each passing day. I believe I am close to breaking through, asterisk. I snapped the book shut, my breath catching in my throat. The air around me felt colder, heavier, as though the basement itself disapproved of my intrusion. I hurried upstairs, leaving the boxes and their unsettling contents behind. The journal sat on the kitchen table, staring at me like an accusation. Who was Elias Hawthorne, and what exactly had he done here? That evening, I decided to take Howard up on his offer. I walked down the street to his house, a modest brick bungalow with a neatly kept lawn. He opened the door before I could even knock, as though he'd been expecting me. "Claire," he said, his expression unreadable. "Everything all right? Do you know anything about the man who built my house?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. "Elias Hawthorne?" Howard's face darkened. He stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. "You better sit down." I followed him into the living room, where he handed me a cup of tea before settling into an armchair. "Elias Hawthorne built that house over a century ago," Howard began. "He was a strange man, kept to himself mostly. Folks around here didn't trust him, said he was into unnatural things." "What kind of things?" Howard hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the window as if he expected someone or something to be watching. "Rituals, summoning spirits, if you believe the stories. People said they'd see strange lights coming from the windows late at night, hear voices chanting, even though he was the only one living there. And then he disappeared," Howard said simply. "One day, he was just gone. No one knows what happened to him. Some say he opened a door to something he couldn't close and paid the price for it." I shivered, clutching the cup of tea to steady my hands. "Do you believe that?" Howard's gaze was steady. "I believe there are things in this world we're better off leaving alone. And I believe your house has a way of holding on to its secrets." I didn't sleep that night. How could I, with the weight of what I'd learned pressing down on me? Around midnight, the house came alive again. The floorboards creaked, the walls groaned, and faint whispers seemed to drift through the air. This time, the footsteps weren't confined to the hallway. They echoed up the stairs, slow and deliberate, like someone was taking their time. I lay frozen in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. Then, just as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs, they stopped. The silence was deafening. Suddenly, the closet door across the room creaked open, inch by agonizing inch. I couldn't breathe. My eyes were locked on the closet door, which had opened just wide enough to reveal a sliver of darkness within. The shadows seemed deeper, thicker, almost alive. My rational mind screamed at me to get up, to move, to do something. but my body refused to obey. I lay there, paralyzed, as though the weight of the entire house had pressed down on me. A soft creak echoed from inside the closet, the sound of wood shifting under pressure. Something was in there. I could feel its presence as surely as I could feel my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Finally, I found the strength to move. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing squarely on the closet. It was empty. I sat up slowly, shining the light into every corner of the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The closet was just a closet. Nothing more than a collection of clothes and boxes piled haphazardly on the floor. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I called out of work. I couldn't face the office, not after a night like that. Instead, I spent the day combing through the house, trying to find some kind of explanation for what was happening. I started with the closet. Beneath the pile of shoes and forgotten trinkets, I found a small trapdoor, hidden under an old rug. The edges were worn, as though it had been opened and closed many times over the years. It took some effort, but I managed to pry it open. Beneath was a narrow shaft leading down into the darkness, with a rickety wooden ladder bolted to the side. The smell that wafted up was damp and earthy, tinged with something faintly metallic. For a long moment, I just stared into the abyss, debating whether I had the courage or the foolishness to go down there. Finally, I grabbed a flashlight and started my descent. The ladder creaked under my weight, each step sending a shiver of unease through me. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, circular room with stone walls and a dirt floor. The air was thick and heavy, and the beam of my flashlight seemed to struggle against the darkness. In the center of the room was a crude stone altar, stained dark with something I didn't want to think about. Surrounding it were strange symbols carved into the walls, the same ones I'd seen on the cover of Elias Hawthorne's journal. A wave of nausea rolled over me as I took in the scene. This wasn't just some eccentric hobby. This was something far darker. I spent hours in the library that afternoon, poring over old records and newspaper clippings. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing the story became. Elias Hawthorne hadn't just been a recluse. He'd been part of a secretive cult that practiced rituals meant to bridge the gap between worlds. According to one article, the cult believed that certain places, like my house, were thin spots where the veil between the living and the dead was weakest. The rituals were meant to open doors, to summon spirits, or worse. I found an account from a man who had attended one of Elias's gatherings. He described strange chanting, glowing symbols, and a palpable sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the walls. But the most chilling detail was this. Elias had claimed that once the door was opened, it could never truly be closed. That night, the house felt different. The air was colder, heavier, and the usual creaks and groans seemed sharper, more intentional. I sat in the living room with the journal open on my lap, reading by the light of a single lamp. December 21st, 1913. Asterisk, they are here. I can feel them watching me, waiting. The door is open and they will not leave until they have what they want. I must finish what I started. I must contain them, asterisk. I flipped to the next entry, but the page was blank. The rest of the journal was empty. A sudden crash from upstairs jolted me out of my thoughts. I jumped to my feet, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. The sound had come from my bedroom. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the top, I saw that the bedroom door was wide open, though I was certain I'd closed it earlier. The lamp on my nightstand had been knocked over, and the closet door was ajar once again. As I stepped into the room, the air grew colder. I could see my breath fogging in front of me, and the faint sound of whispering filled my ears. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to come from all around me. And then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence was suffocating. I turned slowly, my flashlight sweeping across the room. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure stood in the corner, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet wouldn't budge. The figure stepped forward, and the room seemed to warp around it, the walls bending and shifting as though the house itself were alive. I finally found my voice and screamed. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed as the shadowy figure loomed closer. The temperature in the room plummeted, and my breath puffed out in quick, shallow bursts. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic beams of light across the walls. "Who's there?" I croaked, though the question felt absurd. Whatever I was seeing wasn't human. The figure stopped at the foot of the bed, its form shifting and writhing like smoke caught in an invisible wind. And then, as if responding to my question, it tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a shiver down my spine. I scrambled for the door, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst. The moment my hand touched the doorknob, the room erupted with sound. A deafening cacophony of whispers, screams, and guttural growls filled the air, as if every corner of the house was alive with voices. I yanked the door open and bolted down the hall, my footsteps echoing loudly against the wooden floor. The whispers followed me, chasing me down the stairs and into the living room. There, I stopped, panting and trembling. The whispers faded into silence, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. I stood in the middle of the room, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but none of them could account for what I'd seen, what I'd felt. The next day, I considered leaving, packing my things, abandoning the lease, and never looking back. But something held me back, an insidious curiosity, a need to understand what was happening in that house. I spent the afternoon researching the symbols I'd seen in the basement. The library offered little help, but I found a local historian who specialized in occult practices. Her name was Margaret, and she was as eccentric as I'd expected. Thick glasses, a collection of silver jewelry, and an unsettling intensity in her eyes. "You say these symbols were carved into the walls?" she asked, flipping through an old leather-bound book. "Yes," I replied, "and they were on a journal I found. The house belonged to a man named Elias Hawthorne." Margaret's expression darkened. "I've heard that name before. Hawthorne was infamous in certain circles. He was deeply involved in rituals meant to summon. Well, things best left alone." "What kind of things?" She hesitated, as if debating whether to tell me the truth. "Entities," she said finally. "Spirits, demons, beings from other realms. His house was said to be a thin spot, a place where the veil between worlds is weak. He believed he could control what came through, but what? He was wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. Margaret's words echoed in my mind, weaving into the memories of the shadowy figure and the whispers that seemed to come from the walls. I sat in the living room with the journal in my lap, flipping through its pages for the 100th time. Most of it was cryptic and fragmented, but one passage caught my attention. "Asterisk, they grow stronger with each passing night. The house is theirs now, but I cannot leave. If I leave, they will follow me. They are bound to the place, but they are bound to me as well, asterisk." I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding. Was that what was happening to me? Had I somehow become a part of whatever curse plagued this house? A sudden knock at the door made me jump. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Who would be visiting at this hour? Cautiously, I approached the door, peering through the peephole. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, slowly, a face appeared, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. I stumbled back, my heart racing. When I looked again, the face was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. The whispers returned around 3 a.m., softer this time, almost melodic. They seemed to be calling to me, urging me to come back upstairs. I refused to go. Instead, I sat on the couch with every light in the house turned on, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. As the hours crawled by, I began to notice something strange. The house seemed different. The angles of the walls were slightly off. The floors seemed to slope in ways they hadn't before, and the shadows stretched longer than they should. It was as if the house itself was shifting, warping into something unfamiliar. When the sun finally rose, I felt a brief flicker of relief. But that relief was short-lived, because as the light poured through the windows, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the wooden floor, directly in front of the couch, was a symbol I hadn't seen before. It was intricate and jagged, with sharp angles and looping curves that seemed to twist and writhe if I looked at them for too long. The message was clear. I wasn't safe, not even in the daylight. I couldn't take my eyes off the symbol carved into the floor. It seemed alive, pulsating with a faint energy that made my skin crawl. The longer I stared, the dizzier I felt, like the edges of my vision were closing in. I forced myself to look away and stumbled to the kitchen, splashing cold water on my face. The water was icy, more so than it should have been, and for a moment, I thought I heard whispers again, soft, muffled voices coming from the drain. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "It's just your imagination," but deep down, I knew better. That afternoon, I called Margaret again. She agreed to meet me at a small coffee shop in town. I arrived early, clutching the journal like a lifeline. Margaret arrived a few minutes later, her expression grave. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, sitting across from me. "I think I have," I replied, my voice trembling. I opened the journal and pointed to the passage I'd read the night before. "What does this mean?" "They are bound to the place, but they are bound to me as well." What was Hawthorne talking about? Margaret's face paled. "It means you're part of it now," she said. "The house doesn't just trap whatever's inside. It attaches itself to anyone who lives there. You're caught in its web." I stared at her, struggling to process her words. "But why me? I didn't do anything." "You didn't have to," she said. "The house chooses. It feeds on fear, on emotions. The more you react, the stronger it becomes." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Was that why the occurrences were getting worse? Because I was afraid? Margaret leaned in closer. "Listen to me carefully. If you want to survive, you have to find a way to break the connection. Hawthorne's rituals left a mark on that house, a scar. You need to find the source of that scar and sever it." "How?" I asked. She hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn book. "This might help," she said. "It's a collection of protective rituals and symbols. But be careful. If you do it wrong, you could make things worse." That night, I sat in the living room with Margaret's book open on the coffee table. I felt like a character in one of those horror movies I used to laugh at, the kind where the protagonist makes all the wrong decisions. But this wasn't a movie. This was real, and I was desperate. The book detailed a ritual meant to seal the space, cutting off its connection to any malevolent forces. It required specific steps, including lighting candles, drawing protective symbols, and reciting an incantation. I gathered the supplies from around the house, a box of white candles, a piece of chalk, and a bowl of salt, and began the ritual in the living room. The house was eerily quiet as I worked. The only sound the scratch of chalk on wood as I drew the symbols Margaret's book described. When everything was ready, I lit the candles and began to recite the incantation. At first, nothing happened. The room was still, the air heavy with the scent of melting wax. But then a low hum filled the air, barely audible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The flames of the candles flickered wildly, and the shadows on the walls seemed to twist and contort. I kept chanting, my voice trembling but determined. The hum grew into a roar, and suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. The candles went out, leaving me in complete blackness. And then I felt it, a presence cold and heavy, pressing down on me from all sides. "You shouldn't have done that," a voice whispered, so close it felt like it was right in my ear. I froze, my heart pounding. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. The voice laughed, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "I am the house," it said, "and you are mine." I don't know how I found the courage to move, but somehow I did. I grabbed the journal and bolted for the stairs, my only thought to get to the basement. If the house was the source of this nightmare, then the basement was its heart. The door to the basement stood ajar, and as I descended the creaking stairs, I felt the temperature drop with each step. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. At the bottom of the stairs, the symbols carved into the walls seemed to glow faintly, as if mocking my attempt to banish them. In the center of the room, the stone slab stood waiting, its surface covered in dark stains that I didn't want to think about. I placed the journal on the slab and opened it to a blank page. Then, using the chalk, I began to copy the symbols from Margaret's book onto the floor around me. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent this time. They hissed and snarled, urging me to stop, to leave, to give up. But I didn't. When the last symbol was drawn, I placed a bowl of salt in the center of the circle and lit another candle. The air in the basement grew heavy, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows danced wildly, taking on shapes that looked disturbingly human. I began to chant again, my voice shaking but resolute. The room trembled, and for a moment, I thought the house might collapse around me. But then, with a deafening crack, the air seemed to split open, and a blinding light filled the room. When the light faded, the basement was silent. The oppressive weight was gone, and the symbols on the walls had disappeared. I climbed the stairs slowly, half expecting the whispers to return, but they didn't. The house was quiet, too quiet. The silence in the house was almost deafening. I stood there in the dim light, feeling a strange sense of emptiness. The oppressive weight that had once hung in the air was gone, but in its place, something else lingered, something worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. My mind raced as I moved through the house, checking each room, but there was nothing to see. No shadows lurking, no creaking floorboards, nothing but the cold emptiness. And yet it didn't feel right. The house had changed. I returned to the living room, my eyes scanning the walls for any sign of the symbols I had drawn. Nothing. The floor was untouched. The air felt lighter, almost as if I had stepped into a different version of the house. A version that didn't belong to me, but to something else. Something that had been watching me. I was about to sit down when I noticed something on the coffee table. A small, folded piece of paper. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't left anything there. With trembling hands, I unfolded the paper. The words were written in a familiar, shaky handwriting, but it wasn't mine. "You thought you could escape, but you can never leave." A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of the message itself, or the fact that it had appeared out of nowhere. I looked around the room again, but it was still empty. But then I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the walls. Soft at first, but growing louder, like a rhythmic knocking. I froze. My mind flashed back to the first night I'd heard the knocking, when I had convinced myself it was just the house settling. But this was different. The tapping was too deliberate, too purposeful. I moved toward the source, following the sound down the narrow hallway. It grew louder as I approached the door to the basement. The door was closed, but the tapping was unmistakable now. It was coming from inside. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was making a mistake, but there was no turning back. I reached for the handle and pushed the door open. The basement was exactly as it had been, cold, dark, and foreboding. The symbols on the walls were gone, but there was still something about the space that felt wrong. And then I saw it, a figure, standing in the corner, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence. It was as if it was waiting for me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move, but the tapping began again, faster now, as if responding to my question. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure seemed to shimmer in the shadows, its outline flickering like a fading memory. I reached out a hand, but before I could touch it, the figure vanished. The basement was empty again, just like before. But I knew it hadn't been a figment of my imagination. The tapping stopped. The house was still. And then, in the distance, I heard it. A low, mournful cry, echoing through the walls. It sounded almost human. The cry echoed through the house again, sending a wave of unease crashing over me. It was unmistakable. Human, but distorted, like something was trying to speak through it. I didn't know where it was coming from, but it was too close for comfort. My legs felt like lead as I slowly made my way through the hallway. Every footstep sending a jolt through the floorboards. The house had gone quiet again, but the cry still lingered in my mind, a hollow sound that twisted my thoughts. I tried to focus, to rationalize it away, but something in the pit of my stomach told me this wasn't just my imagination. As I approached the living room, the temperature dropped. It was sudden, a stark contrast to the warmth I had felt earlier. My breath came out in a visible mist, and I rubbed my arms for warmth. The shadows seemed to stretch across the room, gathering in the corners like dark, unseen hands reaching out for me. I froze. Something was there. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing by the window. It was vague at first, like a dark silhouette, but as I turned to face it, it became clearer. It was a man. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his posture was rigid, unnatural. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice stuck in my chest. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped by the presence of this figure. The man didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, staring into the darkness outside, as if he was waiting for something. A sudden thought struck me. What if it was Hawthorne? What if this was the original owner, the one who had bound this place with his rituals? I had read so much about him in the journal, about the dark forces he had tampered with. But seeing him, or something that looked like him, standing in front of me was a reality I wasn't prepared for. I reached for the journal, feeling the weight of it in my hands. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening. But as I opened it, a strange sensation washed over me, a feeling like the room was shifting, bending around me. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The house was silent again, save for the distant sound of something scraping against the floor. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I thought about the basement, the ritual, and the eerie calm that had followed. Had I truly severed the connection? Was the house finished with me? But then the door to the kitchen slammed shut. I spun around, heart racing, but no one was there. The air felt charged now, thick with an energy that was almost tangible. The house seemed alive, as if it were aware of my every move. I took cautious steps toward the kitchen, the silence broken only by the sound of my breath and the occasional creak of the floor beneath me. The kitchen door was slightly ajar, but I hesitated before pushing it open. The shadows inside seemed darker, deeper. I stepped inside, and the temperature plummeted even further. I could see my breath in front of me now, and the strange, musty odor of something rotting filled the air. The tap in the sink was dripping, each drop echoing like a countdown. That's when I saw it, on the counter, an old photograph. It was yellowed with age, the edges curled, but the image was still clear. It showed a man standing in front of the house, a familiar figure. His face was unmistakable. It was Hawthorne, but there was something wrong about the picture. Something off. The man's eyes were black, hollow, empty. I felt a surge of dread wash over me, and the whispers returned, softer now, but insistent. They came from the walls, from the shadows. They filled my mind with thoughts of things I didn't want to know. And then I heard the voice again, A whisper, so close it felt like it was inside my head. Asterisk, you should have never come back. Asterisk, I turned to face the voice, but there was no one there. The kitchen was empty, but I wasn't alone. The air was thick with the presence of something watching me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made things worse. The whisper lingered in my mind, growing louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was vibrating in the very air around me. The words were like a chant, repetitive and unrelenting, making it impossible to focus on anything else. Asterisk, you should have never come back. Asterisk, I grabbed the photograph of Hawthorne, the black-eyed figure staring back at me, and held it in front of my face. But the moment I did, the whispering ceased. It was as if the house had gone silent, holding its breath. I took a deep, shaky breath and looked around. The kitchen, once so cold and oppressive, felt almost normal now, like the storm had passed. But I knew better than to believe it. The house was just waiting for me to let my guard down. I hurried back to the living room, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. I had to figure out what to do next. The basement had been quiet after the ritual, but now, after the strange encounter with the figure and the whispers, I wasn't sure if it had worked. I needed answers. I opened the journal again, flipping through the pages until I reached the section about Hawthorne's last days. The words seemed to blur in front of my eyes, but I forced myself to read them aloud, trying to make sense of it all. He couldn't leave, not until the house had taken its due. My stomach churned. The phrase seemed to echo in my mind, reverberating like a warning. I read it again, the words carving themselves into my thoughts. I needed to understand what that meant. What did the house want from me? And why had it latched on to me, as it had to Hawthorne? As I read, I felt a cold breeze sweep across the room, sending a shiver down my spine. I looked up, expecting to see a window open, but there was nothing. No draft, no explanation, just a sudden chill in the air. Then a sound. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A slow, deliberate tapping from somewhere above. Not the walls this time. It was coming from the ceiling. My heart pounded as I stood, slowly moving toward the stairs. The tapping grew louder, faster, until it was a constant thud, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor above me. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was someone calling to me. With every step I took toward the staircase, the tapping grew more frantic. I reached the top of the stairs, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The hall stretched before me, dark and silent. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, the tapping louder now, like a frantic pounding. I stood there for a long moment, frozen, my mind racing. Was it Hawthorne? Was it the thing I'd seen in the corner of the living room? Or was it something worse? Something I hadn't even begun to understand? I slowly reached for the doorknob. It would cold beneath my fingers. The air around me felt heavy, thick with an oppressive force that made it difficult to breathe. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The attic was dark, but I could make out the outlines of boxes and old furniture. The tapping was louder now, right above my head. I took a step inside, and the floorboards groaned beneath me. Something shifted in the shadows. Something moved. My heart skipped a beat, and I reached for the light switch, but there was no light, just the darkness pressing in on all sides. The tapping stopped, and then, from the corner of the room, I saw it. A figure, a man. His black eyes locked onto mine, and I froze. It was Hawthorne, but he wasn't the man from the photograph. This wasn't a ghost. This wasn't a memory. This was something else entirely. His mouth opened, but the words that came out were not words at all. They were whispers, distorted, indecipherable. They filled the room, pressing in on me, suffocating me. You shouldn't have come back, the voice whispered, louder now, coming from every direction. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, as if the very air around me had wrapped itself around me like a vice. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. The attic was empty again, but the whispers didn't stop. They swirled around me, growing louder, closer. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The house was alive with it now. The tapping, the whispers, the pressure. I had to get out. I had to leave. But as I turned to run, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. I spun around, but no one was there. And yet, I wasn't alone. I could hear the footsteps, clear as day, echoing in the narrow hallway behind me. Each step felt like a hammer strike against my ribs, the sound growing louder, heavier, until it seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one, just the empty, oppressive silence of the house. Yet, the feeling of being watched, the feeling of something following me, was inescapable. I backed away from the attic, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the hallway. The pressure around me grew, like the house was closing in, suffocating me with its ancient, malevolent energy. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. My mind raced as I stumbled down the stairs, each step feeling like a battle against the weight of the house pressing down on me. I reached the living room, and for a moment, everything seemed still. Too still. I thought I might be safe for a second, but the moment I thought that, the whisper returned. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. You can't escape. Asterisk, I froze, my blood running cold. The voice, soft but somehow all-encompassing, seemed to come from inside my skull, vibrating through my very bones. It was everywhere, and it was right. I had no way of escaping. This house wasn't just a house. It was alive, a living thing, feeding on fear, on desperation, and now it had me in its grip. I ran to the door, wrenching it open, but the air outside was as cold and oppressive as the house. The sky above me was dark and clouded, an unnatural twilight, hanging heavy over the town. The wind howled through the trees, but there was no comfort in it, only a sense of doom. I slammed the door shut, my breath ragged as I backed into the living room again. The house felt like it was closing in, the walls shrinking, the shadows reaching out to engulf me. I wasn't just trapped in this place anymore. I was part of it. Asterisk, you are mine. Asterisk, the voice hissed again, closer now, as though it was right next to me. I turned, heart pounding, but once again there was no one. The house was empty, silent, but it wasn't. I grabbed the journal from the coffee table, flipping through it desperately. I needed answers. I needed a way out. I couldn't just be trapped here forever. A single page caught my eye. It was a simple drawing of the house, a rough sketch, but there was something strange about it, something wrong. I stared at it for a long time. The house in the drawing wasn't the house I had moved into. It wasn't just any house. The structure seemed to twist and distort, like it was something out of a nightmare. I turned the page, and the text was even more cryptic. Asterisk, the house devours. The house takes what it wants. It feeds on the weak, on the lost, but it will give you what you crave. The house gives, but only in exchange for your soul. Asterisk, the words sent a chill down my spine. My hands trembled as I read them again. Was this the price? Was this what Hawthorne had done? Was this why the house had chosen me? I looked at the photo of Hawthorne once again, the black-eyed man staring back at me. His eyes were hollow, empty, like he had been consumed by something far worse than death. And then, as if in answer to my silent question, the house groaned, a low, earth-shaking sound that rattled the windows and shook the very foundation. The walls trembled as though they were alive, breathing. The house was waking up. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. It's too late, the voice whispered, no longer coming from just one direction. It seemed to come from every corner, from the walls, from the floor, from the very air. Asterisk, you are bound to us. You are ours now. Asterisk. I staggered backward, my mind spinning. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It felt like the walls were closing in, suffocating me. But then, through the fog of panic, one thought broke through. I had to find the source. The scar in the house. If I could find it, maybe I could destroy it. Maybe I could break the connection. I wasn't going to die here. Not like this. I ran back to the basement door, my hands shaking as I gripped the handle. The basement was where it all began. The symbols, the rituals, the darkness. If I could find the heart of the house, maybe I could destroy it. But as I descended the stairs, the temperature dropped again. My breath came out in icy clouds. I was back in the basement, standing in front of the stone slab once more. The shadows seemed to press against me, as if they were alive, reaching for me. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew it was here. The source, the thing that had caused all this, the scar. I ran my hands over the stone, feeling the cold, rough surface beneath my fingertips. But there was nothing. No secret compartment, no hidden switch. Just a slab. Then I felt it, a pulse. The stone seemed to vibrate beneath my fingers, and the air around me thickened. Something was happening. I stepped back, my heart pounding, and the slab began to shift. The stone slab groaned as it shifted, moving with a slow, agonizing sound, as if something ancient and unwilling was giving way. My pulse raced, fear clutching at my throat, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I had to find the source of this nightmare. The slab finally slid aside with a jarring scrape, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. I hesitated for only a second, my stomach churning with dread, but then, as if compelled by an unseen force, I crouched down and peered into the darkness. It was a narrow passageway, lined with walls that seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in slow, rhythmic movements. The air was thick, suffocating. It smelled of damp earth and something far worse, something metallic like blood. The whispers were louder now, echoing off the walls, coming from all around me. They were speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. They were mocking me, telling me I would never escape. I didn't care. I had to move forward. With a deep breath, I crawled through the passage, the walls pressing in on either side, scraping against my skin. The further I went, the darker it became, until I could barely see my hands in front of my face. The whispers intensified, growing more frantic, like they were warning me, urging me to turn back. But there was no turning back now. The tunnel finally opened into a small chamber, and my breath caught in my throat. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it, an object that I could barely comprehend. It was a heart, a real heart, beating slowly, methodically, as if it were alive. But it wasn't human. The heart was twisted and misshapen, pulsating with an unnatural energy that filled the room with a hum that resonated deep in my bones. It was the source. This was the heart of the house. The thing that had been feeding on fear, feeding on the souls of those unlucky enough to cross its threshold. I stepped closer, my feet dragging in the thick, sticky floor, as if the earth itself was trying to keep me in place. The heart seemed to sense me, pulsing faster, its rhythm quickening as I approached. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered again, its tone now full of malevolence. "Asterisk, you can't stop what's already been set in motion. You are mine. We are bound together." Asterisk. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me again, the walls closing in, the floor beneath me trembling. This was it. This was the source of the scar, the heart that had made the house a living nightmare. I had no choice. I had to destroy it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, silver knife I had found earlier in the attic. The blade gleamed in the dim light, cold and sharp. My hands trembled as I gripped it, the weight of what I was about to do settling on me. With a deep breath, I drove the knife into the heart. At first, nothing happened. Then, the heart began to thrash violently, its pulsations becoming erratic. The air in the chamber thickened, and the whispers turned into screams, shrill and desperate. The walls around me cracked, splitting open as the very foundation of the house seemed to crumble. I pulled the knife out, but the heart was still beating, still alive, and the room was shaking uncontrollably. It was as if the house itself was fighting back. "You can't kill me," the voice hissed, the sound reverberating through my skull. Asterisk, I am eternal. I am the house, and you are nothing. Asterisk, the chamber began to spin, and I felt myself being pulled into the air, weightless. My vision blurred, and for a moment, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the chamber. I was back in the house, except it was different. Everything was wrong. The walls were alive, crawling with shadows that reached out, twisting and turning. The floor beneath me was slick with something wet, and the air was thick with a stench of decay. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was frozen in place, trapped. "You belong to me now," the voice whispered, soft this time, as if it was pleased. Asterisk, you will never leave. Not now, not ever. Asterisk, I couldn't escape. There was no way out. The house had claimed me, body and soul. The house was suffocating. I could feel it closing in on me, the walls pressing against my chest, the floor beneath me shifting like a living thing. Every breath I took felt like it would be my last, the air thick with a sense of finality. It was as if the house had become a giant maw, and I was its prey, trapped in its grasp, unable to escape. There was no more whispering, no more mockery. It was as if the house had become silent in its victory. But the silence was worse than anything. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, but a waiting quiet, like the moment before a storm. The weight of the silence pressed in on me, wrapping around me like chains, each second dragging me deeper into the house's dark embrace. I struggled to move, to break free of the invisible chains that held me in place. My limbs felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else. Every muscle in my body screamed, but my arms and legs refused to cooperate. I could feel the floor beneath me trembling, shifting like a living thing. It was as if the house itself was aware of my every movement, its ancient, rotting walls tightening around me like a noose. The temperature had plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs, freezing as it met the air. My skin felt cold, colder than I had ever known. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, but it did little to stave off the icy chill that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The house had become a tomb, and I was its unwilling occupant. But I wasn't alone. I could feel something else in the room with me. It was there, just beyond my vision, watching, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, every instinct screaming at me to run, to escape. But where could I go? The house was everywhere, its very foundation set to trap me. I tried to scream, to call for help, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was like the house had stolen my voice, leaving me mute, powerless. My body trembled uncontrollably, my heart pounding in my chest as the air grew thicker, heavier. And then I heard it, a low groan, deep within the bowels of the house. It wasn't a sound I could place, more like the creaking of a wooden floorboard under unbearable pressure, or the groan of an old, dying tree. The entire house seemed to shudder in response, and for a moment, I thought I might lose my balance, as if the very ground was about to give way beneath me. The walls cracked, a jagged sound that tore through the silence, followed by the ceiling above me trembling, as though it were being torn apart. The light from the flickering candle threw long, twisted shadows across the walls, and they danced, contorted into shapes that were far too human, too familiar. I turned around, heart racing, but when my eyes scanned the room, there was nothing there. The shadows had receded, and the air was still again, but I could feel the weight of something or someone watching me. You thought you could escape. The voice echoed in my mind, so clear that it was as if the words came from within me. The tone was low, mocking, full of a terrifying certainty that made my blood run cold. Asterisk, you thought you could break free, but you belong to me, forever. Asterisk, I froze. The voice wasn't coming from anywhere I could see. It was inside me, echoing in my skull, inside the hollow space between my thoughts. I stumbled backward, my legs giving way as I sank to my knees. The ground beneath me trembled again, this time more violently. The floorboards creaked and groaned, and I could hear something huge, shifting beneath the house. The walls seemed to bend inward, the entire structure warping, as if the very bones of the house were alive. You belong to me, the voice repeated louder now, its tone growing darker. Asterisk, and I will never let you go. Asterisk. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding. I tried to move, but my body felt like it was made of stone. My limbs were heavy, slow to respond. The house seemed to pulse around me, each beat of its twisted heart reverberating through the floor and up into my bones. The air thickened and the temperature dropped even further, until it felt like I was standing in the frozen depths of an uncharted cave. I could see my breath hanging in the air in front of me, thick clouds of mist swirling as I exhaled. I pulled my arms around myself, trying to stave off the cold, but it was no use. The house was colder than anything I had ever known. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the trembling stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. It pressed in on me, heavy and oppressive. The shadows on the walls no longer danced. They were still unmoving. I thought I heard something shift, a slight scraping sound, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Nothing but the darkness that filled the corners of the room. You can't run, the voice whispered, so close now that I could feel its breath on my neck. It was a slow, soft hiss, like the wind through cracked glass. Asterisk, there's nowhere left to go. Asterisk, I could feel something stir at the edges of my mind, a memory that had been buried, hidden away, the feeling of the journal in my hands, the symbols, the ritual that had been supposed to save me. But it had only made things worse. The house had taken something from me, and I had no idea what it was. All I knew was that I was losing myself. I can't escape, I whispered aloud, my voice barely audible. But the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Asterisk, can I? Asterisk. The silence that followed was deafening. Then a deep, rumbling laugh filled the air, vibrating through my chest and rattling my bones. You're already trapped, the voice said, its tone mocking and cruel. Asterisk, you always have been. Asterisk. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The weight of the house pressed down on me, crushing me under its immense power. The floor shifted again, and I felt myself being pulled, drawn towards something dark, something that was pulling me deeper into the bowels of the house. The ground cracked open beneath me. A jagged fissure appeared in the floor, blackness spilling out from the crack, as if the very heart of the house was exposed, waiting to swallow me whole. I fell to my knees, unable to move, unable to fight back. The house had won, and then the whispers came again, but this time they were louder, more frantic, more desperate. 100 voices overlapping, each one shouting over the other, repeating something I couldn't understand. It was a chant or maybe a prayer, but the words blurred into one continuous, agonizing scream. No escape, the voice whispered, its tone sweet, almost comforting now. Asterisk, you are mine, forever. Asterisk. I reached out, my hands trembling, desperate for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. The darkness closed in around me, swallowing everything in its path. I tried to fight it, but my body wouldn't obey. I was helpless, fading, sinking into the darkness. The last thing I heard was the voice, now triumphant, whispering in my ear, Asterisk, welcome home. Asterisk, story 2. I wasn't supposed to be here. I had never imagined I'd find myself in a tiny, unfamiliar town alone, trying to start over. But life doesn't always go according to plan, and that's how I ended up moving into a house that most people would consider cursed, though I didn't know it at the time. The divorce had shattered me. After years of being with someone, you start to believe that you know everything about them, but when it all falls apart, you realize just how much you never understood. I needed a fresh start, something far from the life I had built, far from the memories that haunted me at every corner. I found this house online, an old Victorian-style home on the outskirts of town. It was cheap, too cheap for its size and location, and that's what drew me in. I told myself I was just trying to start over in a quiet town, away from the hustle, away from the reminders. But deep down, there was a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. Still, I pushed it aside. I had to make this work. The house itself was massive, the kind that looked better in pictures than it did up close. The wooden panels on the exterior were peeling, the windows dark and unwelcoming, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. There was something off about it, but I didn't know what. I figured it was just the age of the place, the kind of charm older homes sometimes have. I was greeted by an old lady who lived next door. Her name was Mrs. Clarkson. She had been living there for as long as I could remember, she told me. Her house was tidy and well kept, and she was a small woman with a warm, weathered face. But her eyes, they weren't friendly. They were guarded, almost as if she had seen something she wished she hadn't. "Well, I'm sure you'll love it here," she said, her voice kind but sharp. "It's a nice place, but, well, it has its history." I didn't know what she meant by that. I assumed she was just trying to offer a word of caution to the new neighbor, maybe trying to make me feel welcome. But then she added, almost too casually, "People say strange things have happened in that house. You'll hear things. And some folks, they just don't stay long." Her eyes met mine then, and I could have sworn there was something not quite right in them, like a flicker of recognition, or perhaps fear. I smiled awkwardly, unsure how to respond. "I'm sure it's just the age of the house," I said, brushing it off. "It's probably just creaking and settling." She nodded, but I noticed her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. She didn't say anything more, but her warning hung in the air like an unspoken truth, and I couldn't quite shake it. I walked into the house, my footsteps echoing on the old wooden floors. The air was musty, filled with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic, like rust. I felt the weight of the house, like it was alive in some way, watching me. I set down my bags and began unpacking, trying to ignore the strange feeling settling in my chest. The walls creaked and groaned with every movement, as if the house itself was waking up. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was just the house's age. Nothing more. That night, I tried to settle in and get some rest. The wind outside howled against the house, making the windows rattle in their frames. It was the kind of night that would have been peaceful anywhere else, but in this house, with its creaking walls and faint sounds, it felt wrong. I tried to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, a noise would jolt me awake, a soft tapping, the faintest footsteps from somewhere upstairs. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe the house settling. But deep down, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The next morning, as I sat in the kitchen drinking my coffee, I saw Mrs. Clarkson again. She was out in her garden, trimming some flowers, and she waved when she saw me through the window. I opened the door to say hello, but before I could, she called out to me, her voice low and urgent. "I forgot to mention something yesterday," she said. "You're going to want to lock the door at night, especially the attic door. It's better that way." The tone in her voice caught me off guard. There was a sharpness to her words, a warning buried beneath the surface. "The attic?" I asked, my voice a little too hesitant. She nodded, eyes flickering toward my house. "The attic door. Don't open it at night. There's a reason it's locked up there." I opened my mouth to ask more, but she turned back toward her flowers, dismissing the conversation with a casual wave. Her eyes, though, they were filled with something I couldn't place. Fear, maybe, or regret. I thought about what she said, but I pushed it aside. I had enough to deal with, moving into this house, starting over. I didn't need to get caught up in old rumors. But that night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I couldn't shake the thought of that attic. What could be up there? What could possibly make her so scared of it? I tossed and turned, unable to ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. That voice in my head, the one I had been ignoring, grew louder with every creak of the house. There was something in the air, something heavy, something that wanted me to stay away. And as the wind howled outside and the shadows in the corners of my room grew longer, I realized maybe Mrs. Clarkson wasn't just warning me about the house's age. Maybe she was trying to warn me about something else entirely, something I didn't understand yet. The following days seemed to blur together. I kept busy, unpacking and setting things up around the house. But the weight of Mrs. Clarkson's warning about the attic lingered in my mind. It wasn't that I was afraid, not exactly, but there was a sense of dread that gnawed at me, like I was missing something important, something that had been left unsaid. The house itself was full of peculiarities. It wasn't just the noises at night or the creaking floorboards, though those were unsettling enough. There was something about the atmosphere here. The air was thick with a sense of history, like the walls themselves were holding on to secrets. I noticed the smell more as the days went on, an odd metallic scent that seemed to come and go. It wasn't constant, but when it was there, it clung to the air in a way that made my stomach twist. I couldn't quite place it, but it was always strongest in the hallway near the stairs. I didn't think much of it at first, just the natural smells of an old house, right? But one night, a few days after Mrs. Clarkson's warning, I was standing at the foot of the stairs when I heard something, soft, like footsteps. But they weren't coming from downstairs. They were coming from above, from the attic. The noise was slow and deliberate, like someone walking around, dragging their feet. I froze, my pulse quickening. For a moment, I stood there, listening to the sound, wondering if I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the house settling, I thought. But there was something about it that didn't sit right. The steps weren't random. They were measured, almost like someone was pacing back and forth. I told myself it was nothing. The attic was just an old storage space. Maybe the wind was causing the noise, or the house was shifting under the weight of the age. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. Mrs. Clarkson was outside again, sitting on her porch this time, her eyes scanning the yard. When she saw me, she gave a small, tight-lipped smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying a hint of something cautious. "Morning," I replied, trying to seem cheerful. I was just thinking of taking a walk around the block. She nodded but didn't immediately respond. It was as though she was weighing something in her mind. Then, after a long pause, she spoke again. "You know," she said, her voice dropping lower, "this town has a history, a long one, and this house, well, it's part of it." I raised an eyebrow, trying to keep the conversation light. "You mentioned something about the attic the other day. What's up there? Is it just old stuff?" She glanced over her shoulder, as though checking for someone. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It wasn't always just old stuff up there," she said, her eyes flicking nervously toward my house. "Years ago, there were rumors. Some people say the house is cursed, that it's been marked by the original owner." I took a step closer, intrigued despite myself. "What kind of rumors?" She hesitated, biting her lip as if debating whether to tell me more. Finally, she sighed and leaned in slightly. "Edwin Blackwood was the man who built this house," she began. "He was, well, let's just say he wasn't what he seemed. They say he was obsessed with the occult, with rituals. People say he opened doors to things that shouldn't be opened, things that were never meant to come through." I could feel my heart rate picking up at her words. though I tried to remain calm. It sounded like just another old town rumor, the kind you hear about old houses. But something about the way she spoke, the way she looked at me, made my skin crawl. People say the house is marked, she continued, her voice barely audible now. Marked by what he did up there. In the attic, some say they hear things at night, footsteps, whispers. Others, they've seen things. Things they can't explain. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was too much. I had already convinced myself that the noises I'd heard were just the house settling. But now it felt different. It felt like it was more than that. I could almost hear those whispers she mentioned, lingering in the back of my mind. The sound of footsteps in the attic. I wanted to ask more, to press her for details, but just as quickly as the conversation had started, she seemed to close up. She gave me a strained smile and stood up from her porch. "You'll figure it out soon enough," she said cryptically, before quickly retreating into her house. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of her words pressed down on me. I had to admit, I was curious. If there was any truth to what she said, I needed to know more. I had to. The house wasn't just an ordinary place. It felt alive, almost like it was watching me, waiting for something. That night, I decided I would go up to the attic. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed to know what was up there, what had made Mrs. Clarkson so uneasy. I stood in front of the door, which was old and heavy, though dark with age. The air around it felt thick, almost oppressive, like it was pushing back against me. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the handle. But just as my fingers brushed the cool metal, I heard something. A faint sound, like the scraping of nails against wood, coming from inside the attic. I froze. It was the same sound I had heard in the middle of the night. The footsteps. But this time, it was closer, almost like someone or something was waiting for me. With a shaky breath, I gripped the door handle and pulled. And then everything went dark. I couldn't tell how long I stood there, frozen in the dark hallway, staring at the door. My mind raced, my pulse thumping in my ears. The air felt thick, as though it was pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just the weight of the darkness. It was the feeling that something was behind that door, watching me, waiting. The faint scraping sound continued, almost rhythmic, as if it were counting the seconds before I would make my move. I don't know what drove me to open the door. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a need to face whatever it was that had been haunting my thoughts since I moved in. Whatever it was, I pushed the fear aside and forced myself to turn the knob. The door creaked open, louder than I expected. The air inside was cool, almost unnaturally so, and it smelled musty. As the door slowly inched open, I saw the attic, illuminated only by the dim light from the hallway. The stairs were narrow and steep, leading up into a small, cramped space. The ceiling was low, and the rafters crisscrossed overhead like twisted bones, casting strange shadows across the floor. Old boxes and pieces of furniture were stacked haphazardly around the room, covered in dusty sheets. It felt like a graveyard of forgotten things, the kind of place where memories go to die. I stepped inside, my feet creaking against the old wooden floorboards, and immediately noticed how the temperature dropped even further. It wasn't just cold. It was a biting, oppressive chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I shivered and looked around, my eyes searching the room for anything that could explain the strange noises. The space was cluttered, like someone had abandoned it in a hurry. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first glance, but there was a heavy feeling in the air, something almost tangible. I slowly made my way toward the far end of the attic, where a large trunk sat in the corner, partially hidden behind stacks of old furniture. The scraping sound was louder now, as though it was coming from inside the trunk itself. I hesitated, wondering if I should turn back, but I couldn't, not after everything I'd heard. I crouched down beside the trunk and hesitated for a moment before reaching for the latch. My hand trembled as I lifted it, the cold metal biting into my skin. The trunk opened with a creak, and I was met with a faint smell of old paper and something else, something sharp, almost metallic. Inside the trunk were stacks of old journals and papers, their edges yellowed with age. I pulled one of the journals free and opened it to the first page. The writing was cramped and uneven, as if the author had been in a hurry or had something to hide. The first entry was dated almost 100 years ago, and it sent a shiver through me as I read the words. Underscore, the ritual is set. Tonight, the door will open. Tonight, we will summon what should not be summoned. The house will be ours, and with it, the power to control all things. Underscore, I paused, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. What kind of ritual? What door? I flipped through the pages, each one filled with more cryptic entries about rituals, symbols, and names that meant nothing to me. But as I continued reading, a sense of dread crept up my spine. The entries became more erratic, the handwriting growing more frantic, as if the writer was losing their grip on reality. Underscore, the whispers are getting louder. I can hear them when I sleep. I think it is coming through the door. It wants to be free. It wants to leave. Underscore, it speaks of things I cannot understand. And now it is here, in the walls, in the floor, in my mind. Underscore, I must end it. I must seal the door. Underscore, I felt sick to my stomach as I closed the journal, my hands shaking. This was what Mrs. Clarkson had meant when she spoke of the house's dark history, the rituals, the curse, the door that had been opened, a door that should never have been touched. I stood up, my head spinning. I felt as though the walls of the attic were closing in around me. That's when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. But this time, they were louder, closer. They echoed in the attic, each step deliberate, heavy. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, my eyes scanning the darkness, searching for the source. And then I saw it, a shadow. It moved across the far wall, stretching long and thin like something reaching out, its shape unnatural. It wasn't a person, but something else, something far worse. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The shadow shifted, its form warping as it drew closer, its presence filling the room like a suffocating fog. The footsteps grew louder, and with them came a voice, a whisper, soft but clear, like someone speaking right next to my ear. Underscore, you shouldn't have come. Underscore, I spun around, but the attic was empty. The shadow was gone, and the footsteps had stopped. My heart raced, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the trunk. I didn't know what I was seeing, whether it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. But one thing was clear. There was something in this house, something that wasn't human. The chill in the air had turned to ice, and the smell of metal was stronger now, filling my nostrils as I backed toward the stairs. I didn't know what I had unleashed by coming up here, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I didn't wait to investigate further. I didn't need to. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the attic as I fled down the stairs, desperate to get away from whatever had been waiting up there. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, gasping for breath. But even as I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Something was still waiting. I couldn't tell how long I stood there, frozen in the dark hallway, staring at the door. My mind raced, my pulse thumping in my ears. The air felt thick, as though it was pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just the weight of the darkness. It was the feeling that something was behind that door, watching me, waiting. The faint scraping sound continued, almost rhythmic, as if it were counting the seconds before I would make my move. I don't know what drove me to open the door. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a need to face whatever it was that had been haunting my thoughts since I moved in. Whatever it was, I pushed the fear aside and forced myself to turn the knob. The door creaked open, louder than I expected. The air inside was cool, almost unnaturally so. and it smelled musty. As the door slowly inched open, I saw the attic, illuminated only by the dim light from the hallway. The stairs were narrow and steep, leading up into a small, cramped space. The ceiling was low, and the rafters crisscrossed overhead like twisted bones, casting strange shadows across the floor. Old boxes and pieces of furniture were stacked haphazardly around the room, covered in dusty sheets. It felt like a graveyard of forgotten things, the kind of place where memories go to die. I stepped inside, my feet creaking against the old wooden floorboards, and immediately noticed how the temperature dropped even further. It wasn't just cold. It was a biting, oppressive chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I shivered and looked around, my eyes searching the room for anything that could explain the strange noises. The space was cluttered, like someone had abandoned it in a hurry. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first glance, but there was a heavy feeling in the air, something almost tangible. I slowly made my way toward the far end of the attic, where a large trunk sat in the corner, partially hidden behind stacks of old furniture. The scraping sound was louder now, as though it was coming from inside the trunk itself. I hesitated, wondering if I should turn back, but I couldn't, not after everything I'd heard. I crouched down beside the trunk and hesitated for a moment before reaching for the latch. My hand trembled as I lifted it, the cold metal biting into my skin. The trunk opened with a creak, and I was met with a faint smell of old paper and something else, something sharp, almost metallic. Inside the trunk were stacks of old journals and papers, their edges yellowed with age. I pulled one of the journals free and opened it to the first page. The writing was cramped and uneven, as if the author had been in a hurry or had something to hide. The first entry was dated almost 100 years ago, and it sent a shiver through me as I read the words. Underscore, the ritual is set. Tonight, the door will open. Tonight, we will summon what should not be summoned. The house will be ours, and with it, the power to control all things. Underscore, I paused, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. What kind of ritual? What door? I flipped through the pages, each one filled with more cryptic entries about rituals, symbols, and names that meant nothing to me. But as I continued reading, a sense of dread crept up my spine. The entries became more erratic, the handwriting growing more frantic, as if the writer was losing their grip on reality. Underscore, the whispers are getting louder. I can hear them when I sleep. I think it is coming through the door. It wants to be free. It wants to leave. Underscore, it speaks of things I cannot understand. And now it is here, in the walls, in the floor, in my mind. Underscore, I must end it. I must seal the door. Underscore, I felt sick to my stomach as I closed the journal, my hands shaking. This was what Mrs. Clarkson had meant when she spoke of the house's dark history. The rituals, the curse, the door that had been opened, a door that should never have been touched. I stood up, my head spinning. I felt as though the walls of the attic were closing in around me. That's when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. But this time, they were louder, closer. They echoed in the attic, each step deliberate, heavy. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, my eyes scanning the darkness, searching for the source. And then I saw it, a shadow. It moved across the far wall, stretching long and thin like something reaching out, its shape unnatural. It wasn't a person, but something else, something far worse. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The shadow shifted, its form warping as it drew closer, its presence filling the room like a suffocating fog. The footsteps grew louder, and with them came a voice, a whisper, soft but clear, like someone speaking right next to my ear. Underscore, you shouldn't have come. Underscore, I spun around, but the attic was empty. The shadow was gone, and the footsteps had stopped. My heart raced, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the trunk. I didn't know what I was seeing, whether it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. But one thing was clear. There was something in this house. Something that wasn't human. The chill in the air had turned to ice, and the smell of metal was stronger now, filling my nostrils as I backed toward the stairs. I didn't know what I had unleashed by coming up here, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I didn't wait to investigate further. I didn't need to. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the attic as I fled down the stairs, desperate to get away from whatever had been waiting up there. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, gasping for breath. But even as I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Something was still waiting. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, that it couldn't be. After all, I was just a regular person, nothing special, nothing extraordinary. But the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling became. The house, this cursed place, had an invisible grip on me, tightening every day. I stopped sleeping altogether. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it. The soft whispers like breath on the back of my neck. The sound of scratching, of movement behind the walls. It was as though something was creeping, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I kept telling myself it was just a house settling. Old wood, old pipes, a little wind, but I couldn't deny the truth any longer. The house was alive in a way that I couldn't explain. I tried to stay busy. During the day, I went to work, ran errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter what I did, when I returned to the house, it felt wrong. Cold drafts, creaking floors, and the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was as if the house had eyes, following me wherever I went. One afternoon, I decided to visit the neighbor, Mrs. Holloway. She was an older woman who lived in the house next door, and she had always been friendly when we exchanged pleasantries. I hoped that she might have some answers, or at the very least, some distraction from the madness. She answered the door, her face creased with age but kind, her eyes sharp despite her frailty. She invited me in, and we sat in her cozy living room, surrounded by thick curtains and the smell of tea and incense. "So, how are you settling in?" she asked, her tone soft but inquisitive. I hesitated, unsure of how to begin. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I needed someone to understand. Actually, I don't think I'm settling in very well. Something strange is happening in my house. I keep hearing things, voices, footsteps. I feel like I'm not alone. Her expression shifted, just a flicker of something darker crossing her face. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "The house, huh? I wondered how long it would take." "What do you mean?" I asked. My curiosity piqued despite the cold grip of dread forming in my chest. Mrs. Holloway paused, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. She took a deep breath and then spoke in a quiet, almost conspiratorial tone. "That house, it has a history, a dark one." I leaned forward, unable to contain my curiosity. "What do you mean? What happened?" Her eyes flicked toward the window, then back at me. She seemed hesitant, like she was debating whether to tell me. It was many years ago, but the stories, they still linger. The house was once owned by a man named Charles Winthrop. He was a strange one, quiet, distant, always kept to himself. But there were rumors that he dabbled in things no one should mess with. "What kind of things?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. She sighed, almost regretfully. "Occult things, rituals, supposedly." He was obsessed with summoning spirits or opening doors to other worlds. People say he never really left the house, that he opened something, some kind of doorway, something he couldn't control. I felt a chill run through me. Is that why the house is like this? Why it feels off? Mrs. Holloway nodded slowly. "Some say the house is cursed, that what he started is still here, still trapped inside the walls. It's never really gone away. That's why the people who've lived there since, they've all had problems. Strange occurrences, people running out of the house in fear, speaking about curses. You're not the first. My mind was racing, trying to process everything she was saying. So, you're saying the house is haunted? That it's what? Cursed? She nodded again, her face grim. Something like that. Whatever Charles Winthrop did, it left a mark on that place. It's not just the house, it's the land too. It's all connected, and once it has you, it doesn't let go. The room felt colder, even though there was a fire burning in the hearth. I could feel my skin prickling with the tension in the air. I stood up abruptly, needing to leave, needing to breathe. "Thank you," I said quickly, already backing toward the door. I need to go." Mrs. Holloway gave me a knowing look as she opened the door for me. "Be careful. Don't ignore what you're feeling. That house will make you doubt yourself. It'll make you question everything you know." I nodded, but inside, I was already questioning everything. Everything I had believed. Everything I thought was real. When I got back to the house, I didn't know what to expect. But what I did find waiting for me was worse than I could have imagined. The house was silent, but there was something in the air, something thick and oppressive. I felt it before I even opened the door. The whispers were louder now, almost desperate. They seemed to call my name, urging me to come closer. I stepped inside, and immediately the air felt colder. The door shut behind me with a soft thud, and the house seemed to sigh, as if it had been waiting for me. That's when I saw it. On the wall in front of me, scratched deep into the paint, were symbols. Symbols I recognized. They were the same ones from the journal, from the diary I had found in the attic. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears, my mind. I could feel them crawling under my skin, like the house itself was trying to invade my thoughts. Underscore, you shouldn't have come back. Underscore, I turned, but there was no one there. And yet, the presence was so strong, so real. It wasn't just in my mind. It was in the air, in the walls. I was no longer alone, and I didn't know how to escape. I didn't know what to do. The house, no. The thing inside it had me in its grasp. I could feel it, pressing it on all sides. The whispers growing louder as I stood there, frozen in place. Every inch of me screamed to run, to leave, but my legs refused to move. It was as though the air itself was thick, heavy, and the house was holding me captive with its own sinister force. I glanced back at the wall where the symbols had appeared. They weren't there before, at least not in plain sight. The scratches were fresh, deep grooves in the plaster, as if something or someone had carved them into the wall with terrible precision. Underscore, what is this? Underscore, I whispered to no one, though I knew the answer was somewhere within me. It was the same as the markings in the attic, the strange, occult symbols I had found in the journal I had barely begun to understand. My hand trembled as I pulled it from my pocket, the journal still in my grasp from earlier that day. It felt colder now, as if it were drawn into the dark atmosphere of the house. I opened it, flipping through the brittle pages that seemed to creak under the pressure. The air seemed to thicken with each page I turned, and I found myself drawn back to the passage I had seen earlier. The one that talked about a ritual, a doorway, and a curse. Underscore, the door is not meant to be opened. What I seek is a power beyond this realm. To gain it, the price is steep, and once you open it, you cannot close it. Underscore, I shuddered, my pulse quickening as I realized what it meant. The symbols on the wall, the ones that seemed to hum in the silence, they were part of this ritual, and I had been drawn into it without even realizing it. I glanced around, feeling a growing panic. The house had felt wrong since I moved in, but now it was worse, almost suffocating. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure I was ready for what I might find. Underscore, he did it. He opened the door, and now it's too late. Underscore, the words from the journal echoed in my mind. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, causing my breath to fog in the air. My heart raced as I felt the house shift around me, the walls seeming to close in, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as if something was moving just below the surface. I needed to understand what had happened here. I needed to know what I was up against. I made my way to the attic, the old staircase creaking under my weight, each step feeling like an eternity. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, and as I stepped inside, the heavy smell of dust and old wood filled my lungs. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel something cold waiting. It was in the far corner of the room, hidden beneath a tattered old blanket, a wooden chest locked tight with iron clasps. My fingers trembled as I moved toward it, the sound of my footsteps deafening in the silence. I bent down, examining the chest, my mind racing. Was this what Charles Winthrop had used to keep whatever he had summoned contained? Or was it something worse? Something that should have never been uncovered? With a deep breath, I pulled at the clasp. It creaked open, revealing a collection of old, yellowing papers and brittle books. I pulled one from the pile, the cover so old it was falling apart in my hands. The words on the cover were almost indecipherable, but I could make out a few letters. Underscore rituals, darkness, gateway, underscore. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I opened the book, flipping through the pages. The more I read, the worse it got. Descriptions of rituals of summoning, of opening doors to other realms. And at the end of the book, a chilling warning. Underscore, the door will never be closed. Once you have opened it, you will never be free. Underscore, the room seemed to close in on me as I read those words, the weight of their meaning pressing down on me. I had thought I was just moving into an old, creaky house, but now I knew the truth. It had always been much more than that. This house had been built on something darker, something that had never fully left. A soft thud echoed from behind me, and I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. But when I looked, there was nothing there, just a shadow stretching across the room, the faint whisper of the wind outside. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the coldness in the air, the whispers creeping just beyond my hearing. They were closer now, and I knew deep down that whatever had been summoned into this place, whatever Charles Winthrop had unleashed, was still here. I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking violently. I needed to leave. I needed to get out, but I couldn't. The house wouldn't let me. I could feel it, like the walls were closing in, pressing me down, suffocating me with its presence. I turned toward the attic door, but something caught my eye. In the corner of the room, near the small window, there was a shadow, a figure, tall and dark, standing still. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was a human. It couldn't be. Underscore no. Underscore I whispered, backing away. Underscore please no. Underscore. But the figure didn't move. It just watched. The temperature dropped further, and I could feel the air thickening, pressing in on me. I turned to run, but the floorboards beneath me seemed to shift, groaning as though something was shifting underneath. My legs felt weak, and I stumbled, barely catching myself. Underscore, you can't leave. Underscore, the voice wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's. It was deep growling, and came from everywhere, wrapping around me like a vice. I froze, my body trembling as the dark figure began to move toward me, its presence growing stronger with every step. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a presence, something alive, something waiting. And I realized with a sickening clarity that whatever was inside this house, it wasn't going to let me go. Not without a price. I couldn't breathe. The air was too thick, too heavy. It pressed down on my chest like an invisible hand, squeezing, suffocating. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat echoing in the oppressive silence of the attic. The dark figure, whatever it was, hadn't moved, but I could feel its presence growing stronger, like it was feeding off my fear. Underscore, you can't leave. Underscore, the voice, deep and guttural, slithered through the air. It wasn't just a sound. It was a weight, a force that seemed to settle into my bones. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, as if the house itself was holding me here. I tried to focus, to force myself to think, but all that came to mind were the words from the journal, the warnings from the books in the chest. Underscore the door will never be closed. Once you have opened it, you will never be free, underscore. My eyes darted around the attic, searching for any escape, any way out. The window was too high to reach, and the door, the only exit, was behind me, blocked by the ever-growing presence of the dark figure. It wasn't moving, not in the way a person would. It was just standing there, watching, waiting. I took a shaky step back, but the floor creaked beneath me, the sound like a shout in the stillness. The figure didn't respond, didn't flinch. It just stood there, a silhouette in the shadows. And then I heard it again, that voice. This time, it was different. It wasn't just a command. It was a question. Underscore, do you know what you've done? Underscore, the word sent a chill down my spine, and I found myself answering before I even realized it. I didn't mean to. I didn't know. There was no response, but I could feel the air shift, like something was listening. Something was considering my words. The figure didn't move, but the pressure in the room increased. It was like the walls themselves were closing in, the space growing smaller and smaller, until it felt like there was no air left to breathe. I didn't know what I had done. I had been so desperate to move on from my past, to start fresh in a new place, a new life. I hadn't known the house had secrets, that it had a history so dark, so twisted, that it would change everything. But it was too late for regrets. Whatever had been unleashed here, whatever had been drawn into this house, it was far beyond my control. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and I forced myself to speak again, though my voice trembled. What do you want from me? For a long moment, there was only silence. The air seemed to hold its breath, and the weight of the figure in the corner seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. My heart raced, my mind spiraling in panic, but then, finally, the figure moved. It was slow at first, just a shift in the darkness, but then it took a step, and another, closer. The floorboards groaned under its weight, but still, it didn't make a sound. My body refused to move. I couldn't run. I couldn't fight. I could only stand there, watching, waiting for whatever was to make its move. Underscore, what do you think it will cost you? Underscore, the voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't just speaking to me. It was inside my head, echoing through my thoughts, twisting them, turning them. Underscore, do you think you can leave without paying the price? Underscore, I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. I could feel it now, the pressure building in my chest, the air growing thick with something that wasn't right. I had opened the door and I couldn't close it. I had let something in, and now it wouldn't let me go. The figure was closer now, almost within arm's reach. I could see the outline more clearly, tall, hunched, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, like they didn't belong to a human. It was all shadow, a void that swallowed the light. And I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. I felt them, cold and unblinking, like they were digging into my soul. And then in the quiet, I heard something else. A whisper, soft at first, but growing louder. A voice, familiar but twisted. I strained to hear it, trying to make sense of the words. Underscore helped me. Underscore, I froze. The voice was mine, but it wasn't. It was distorted, warped, as though someone else was speaking through me. I reached out a trembling hand, but the figure reached for me faster, its long, cold fingers closing around my wrist with a grip that was like ice. Underscore, you opened the door. Underscore, it whispered. Underscore, and now you will stay. Underscore, I tried to pull away, but it was like trying to escape the grip of the house itself. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air growing colder. the darkness pressing against me. It felt like the very foundation of the house was shifting, bending, warping as if it were alive with the weight of the thing that had been let loose. Underscore, you're mine now, underscore, the voice said, and in that moment, I knew there was no escape. I had crossed a line, opened something that should never have been touched. And now the house, and whatever it had brought with it, was going to claim me. The pressure on my wrist tightened, and I gasped, the coldness sinking into my bones. My vision blurred, and the world around me spun, as if everything was being pulled into the darkness. The walls seemed to ripple, the shadows growing deeper, swallowing everything. I wanted to scream, to fight, but it was too late. Underscore, the door had opened, underscore, and there was no closing it. I was no longer alone in the house, and it wasn't going to let me go. The darkness pulled me deeper, and as the last shred of light flickered out, I knew, without a doubt, that I was lost. The house had claimed me, and it would never let me go. Underscore, it had been waiting for me, underscore. I woke up in a cold sweat, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. For a moment, everything felt normal, as if I had just woken from a nightmare. The darkness of my room was comforting, familiar. But then I remembered. Everything came rushing back. The attic, the figure, the voice, the door. I sat up, gasping for air, my head spinning. It wasn't just a dream. I wasn't in my old life anymore. I was here, in this house, in this nightmare that had become my reality. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to convince myself that everything was just some trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew better. The house was changing. The walls were closing in on me. I could feel it now, an oppressive weight in the air, a presence lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. I forced myself out of bed, my legs shaky, and stumbled toward the door. The house was silent, too silent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from every corner. My breath caught when I reached the hallway, my eyes scanning the shadows. I felt it then, that subtle pull, like something was guiding me, leading me back to the attic. No, I couldn't go back there. I'd barely made it out alive, but the pull was too strong, like an invisible tether wrapped around my chest, tightening with every passing second. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening, why this house was suffocating me, why it refused to let me go. I didn't want to, but I found myself walking toward the stairs. The creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet, the only sound that broke the silence. I didn't stop until I reached the attic door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, just as it had the night before, and I stepped inside. The attic was as it had been, dim, cold, filled with dust and forgotten memories. But something had changed. The air was thicker now, heavier, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then I saw it, a figure in the far corner of the attic, standing as still as death, its outline barely visible in the dim light. My heart lurched in my chest. It was the same figure from before, but now it was different. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had form, shape. I could almost make out the details, the elongated limbs, the twisted features, the cold, dark eyes that seemed to glimmer with something more than malice. It wasn't just watching me. It was waiting for me. I stepped back, my mind racing. What was it? What did it want? Before I could react, the figure shifted. It moved toward me with a speed that should have been impossible, its limbs twisting unnaturally, like it wasn't bound by the same laws of physics that governed the world. I froze, paralyzed with fear, unable to move as it came closer, closer still. And then I heard it again. Underscore, do you think you can escape? Underscore, the voice, deep and raspy, whispered from the darkness. It wasn't just coming from the figure. It was coming from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, the very air around me. The words wrapped around me like chains, dragging me down into something cold, something ancient. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind was foggy, and all I could focus on was the figure. its eyes locked on mine. The pressure in the room increased, the air growing colder, the darkness thickening until it felt like I was drowning in it. Underscore, you open the door. Underscore, it hissed. Underscore, now you will pay the price. Underscore, I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was like the house itself was holding me here, trapping me in this nightmare. The shadows around me began to stretch, twisting into shapes that I couldn't comprehend. Faces, pale, distorted faces, began to appear in the darkness, watching me, their hollow eyes staring, judging. Underscore, you are not the first. Underscore, the voice continued, its tone mocking, cruel. Underscore, many have come before you, and they have all failed. Underscore, the figure reached out with one long, twisted hand, its fingers like talons, and I felt an icy coldness wrap around my wrist. The moment it touched me, a jolt of terror shot through my body, like electricity coursing through my veins. I tried to pull away, but its grip was unyielding. Underscore, you cannot escape. Underscore, it whispered again, its breath cold against my ear. Underscore, you belong to this house now. Underscore, suddenly, I was no longer in the attic. The world around me shifted, warped, and I found myself standing in a different place, a different time. The house was the same, but it wasn't. It was older, darker, covered in shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I saw figures, shadows, indistinct shapes, moving in the corners, whispering to each other in a language I couldn't understand. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I was seeing. This was the house in its original form. This was the past. I saw the owner, the one who had been obsessed with the occult. His face was twisted, gaunt, as though he hadn't seen sunlight in years. He was performing a ritual, his hands raised toward the ceiling, chanting in that strange language. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow in response, feeding off his words, his energy. I couldn't look away. I was trapped, forced to witness this twisted scene unfold before me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vision vanished. I was back in the attic, my chest heaving, my heart racing. The figure was still there, still watching. Underscore, you've seen it now. Underscore, it said, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. Underscore, the price has been paid. And now, it's your turn. Underscore, I couldn't escape. The house wouldn't let me. The figure moved closer, its cold fingers tightening around my wrist. And for the first time, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a house. It was a prison that had been built for the souls it had claimed. And I was next. Underscore, you are part of the house now. Underscore, the voice whispered. Underscore, forever. Underscore, as the darkness closed in around me, I knew with horrifying certainty there was no going back. I was trapped, and whatever had been awakened in this house, it was never going to let me go. The darkness engulfed me. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It felt like my chest was being squeezed, the very air being sucked out of me. The figure's grip tightened around my wrist, its fingers digging into my skin, cold and unforgiving. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't form. My mouth felt dry, like I had swallowed sand. The shadows around me flickered, like they were alive, twisting and shifting, pulsing with a strange, ominous energy. I could hear them whispering low and urgent, their voices overlapping in a maddening chorus. They were taunting me, mocking me, as if they knew I was trapped, as if they knew I had no way out. And then I heard it, a faint sound, a soft scraping noise coming from somewhere behind me. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer. My heart began to race. My legs, still frozen, trembled with the effort to move, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear, unable to escape the grip of the figure before me. Underscore, you can't run from it. Underscore, the voice whispered again, its tone low and venomous. Underscore, you opened the door. You released it, and now it's here to stay. Underscore, I wanted to argue, to scream that I hadn't known, that I hadn't meant to any of this. But the words wouldn't come. The only thing I could do was stare at the figure, its glowing eyes fixed on mine, its cold breath brushing against my face. Then, something unexpected happened. The scraping sound grew louder, sharper, like nails dragging across a chalkboard. It was coming from the far corner of the attic. I turned my head, desperate to see what it was, but the darkness was too thick, too suffocating. I could barely make out the shape of the wall, let alone anything else. But the noise did continue, and it grew more frantic. I tried to look back at the figure, but it wasn't there anymore. It had vanished. The grip around my wrist was gone. The air was still cold, but the oppressive weight had lifted. I gasped, my body trembling with the sudden release, as though I had been holding my breath for far too long. The scraping sound was louder now, echoing through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. I had no idea what it was, but it felt like something was trying to break through. Something or someone. The air felt electric, charged with a palpable sense of danger. I couldn't explain why, but I knew that whatever was happening, whatever had been set into motion, was reaching its climax. The house was alive, pulsing with an ancient, malevolent energy. It was no longer just a house. It was a living, breathing entity, and I had become a part of it. I took a shaky step forward, my feet dragging across the floor as I moved toward the source of the noise. The shadows seemed to stretch farther, reaching out, grasping at me with unseen fingers. Every inch of me screamed to turn and run, but I couldn't. Something deep inside, told me that I had no choice but to face whatever lay ahead. And then I saw it. A door. A new door. Hidden in the far corner of the attic. Just barely visible through the dark veil. It was old, weathered, but unmistakable. The handle gleamed faintly, as though it had been polished recently. And above it, carved into the wood, were strange symbols. Symbols I recognized from the journal. The journal I had found in the basement. The one that spoke of rituals of curses and of doors that should never be opened. My breath caught in my throat. I knew then what I had to do. I approached the door, every step feeling like it was pulling me deeper into something dark, something terrible. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, and turned it. The door creaked open. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. It wasn't a room. It wasn't a place at all. It was nothing, an endless void, stretching far beyond the limits of my understanding. The darkness inside was absolute. No walls, no floor, just an empty, infinite abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. I couldn't comprehend it. I couldn't understand it. And then I heard it again. The scraping sound, louder now, closer. It was coming from the void, from beyond the door, and it was drawing nearer. I felt a presence behind me, a cold breath against my neck, a whisper in my ear. Underscore, you opened it. Underscore, the voice hissed, low and guttural. Underscore, and now you will step inside. Underscore, I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the emptiness. Only the void. The air felt thick, like something was waiting to devour me, to drag me into the darkness. My heart raced. My mind screamed at me to turn and run, to close the door, to leave this cursed house forever. But the door was still open. The void was still waiting. I had a choice. I could stay, run, or step into the abyss. Each option felt like a trap, like a trick I couldn't escape. The house had claimed me. It had always claimed me. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was no escaping this place. No running from the curse. No leaving behind what had been set into motion the moment I had walked through that front door. I looked back at the void. The scraping noise was almost deafening now. It was coming closer, faster, as though something was reaching out from within the darkness, pulling me in. Underscore, there is no way out. Underscore, the voice said, its tone low and knowing. Underscore, there never was. Underscore, I stepped forward, and then I heard the final whisper, soft and chilling. Underscore welcome home. Underscore the door slammed shut behind me, and the world vanished into darkness. And the house? The house remained, waiting for its next victim.